Thank you all for coming. Really excited to host this series at Dear Mama with Columbia Business Hub. And I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Zach Sharaga. I'm the owner of Dear Mama. This is a really important discussion that we're looking to have today and hope that it will have your attention and perhaps future buy-in. I'll turn it over to Bruce Kogut, and he'll take it from here.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you to Cafe Mama for allowing us to use the space and all the great people who are working back there. The idea of using the space was to try to have a more personal sort of conversation, people talking about things which are of the moment, things which are challenging, and certainly the topic tonight is something which people are thinking about and we are debating. We created over the business school something called the Hub. It has 3 parts, and we are what's called the Hublet. So we have a hub over the business school, and there's 3 parts, and we're a Hublet. We are the business, AI, and democracy Hublet, which is bringing in events to the business school in this space we have out here. And we've been very eager to have especially a series of talks on the issues of democracy centered around the Ukraine and misinformation in general. So tonight we're very lucky to have 2 great speakers to have this. I've known Jan Svejnar for some time, going back, I don't know, almost embarrassing, about 25, 30 years ago, when there was something happened in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and we were both had common origins at that moment, talking about many things which came to pass or did not come to pass. Jan's an economist at SIPA, which is our School of International Affairs here at Columbia. I am going to add to Jan, he also ran for president of the Czech Republic. It's too late to vote for him. So some places you can do that in, but not in the Czech Republic. But he did get 48% of the vote, which is pretty remarkable, especially because they knew he was an academic and they still voted for him, which is always amazing. And he runs here the Center for Global for Global Economic Governance, CGEG, which has many people here from that center. The star of the show today is Yuriy Gorodnichenko, who is a professor at Berkeley, graduated from Michigan, I believe, where you may have met Jan, I think, back in those times. And they've done a lot of work together. Yuriy is known for many things. He could have been here to talk about inflation, because that's his area of expertise, among other things. But tonight he's going to talk about this report, which was developed by a think tank on the issues of Ukraine and what's going to happen in the future. How do you bring it into a brighter future? So it's not about looking back at the past. Well, I guess it's one thing about this cafe is you get babies crying in the background. So but it's looking forward to what can be done. What are the ways when this war is over soon? Ukraine is going to grow and become a full member of the EU. So that's the vision for tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you first, as you moderate.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I should rat on him too. So Bruce is one of the most accomplished scholars actually in social sciences. So if you want a sort of social scientist par excellence, it's Bruce Kogut. Worked in a number of universities here, also in Europe, in SEAD and other places. So really a seasoned person. It has been a pleasure to know him and work with him and exchange ideas ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was, as he indicated, major event at the time. Yuriy is one of the really foremost macroeconomists of our times, and right now he's taking a detour and applying his skills to Ukraine, reconstruction and everything. He was very kind to have invited me to join him in Ukraine several years ago for brainstorming with the economics ministers, and so I have had interest in the area for quite a long time now, and it's a pleasure to be here and have Yuriy with us, because he is, I would say, right now undoubtedly the foremost expert on what is happening in Ukraine and what can be done there going forward, and so it's a pleasure to be with him and with you here right now. So Yuriy, kick it off. Yuriy has a major Bible-like looking document that we'll share with you. Here it is. Right.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Jan. It's a great pleasure to be here. We had a question very early in the war: what is going to be the outcome? Who is going to win? What is going to be the future of Ukraine? And in early March, I got a call from the president of the Center of Economic Policy Research, and she said, "Yuriy, we have to think about the reconstruction of Ukraine." This was March 2022. And at that point, it was not clear at all there is any future for Ukraine, or if there is much of Ukraine that is going to be left. And so I told her, "You must be crazy. This is not the time to write a book or any kind of report about the reconstruction of Ukraine." And she said, no. Ukraine will win. Ukraine will be a successful country. It is going to be very important to have a plan. We want to be ahead of the curve. We want to develop this plan. You have my authorization as president to assemble a team of people who are going to contribute to this volume. And so you have a blank check, start writing. And I said, well, she is not a Ukrainian, she is German or Swiss. And I'm like, okay, if she thinks so, I must be thinking even more so. So it's really the time to get everything together and start writing. Now, by academic standards, this book was written very, very fast. I started to approach people in June or July of 2022, and I told them, look, it's going to be a collection of chapters. I want a first draft of this chapter in September. And people were September this year or next year. And in Europe, people take August vacation very, very seriously. So some people told me, look, I can't really do this. I'm going to be busy, taking a vacation, so I'm not really available to do this. But to my great surprise, many people agreed. It was a collection of amazing people. It's a terrific team. And, in the end, we have this book, which was published, in December, but we had an earlier version, kind of a working paper version, ahead of time. And so now I think, everybody is talking about the reconstruction of Ukraine. We're all thinking, okay, so we have current needs in Ukraine, but what is the next step? And I think it's very important because we often talk about the Marshall Plan, how we can help Ukraine after the war. And we should all realize that the Marshall Plan arrived in Europe in 1948. The war was over in Europe in 1945. It was 3 years before the aid, big scale, arrived to Europe. It was a very difficult time. We don't have to repeat this mistake, right? We have to be ahead of the game. We can develop these plans now. And frankly, one of the things we have in the report is that you can start rebuilding now. Many of the things we suggest are based on the experience of transition economists. What do you do when you need to change institutions? What is the sequence of steps? Who is going to do this? When is the right timing? So we can learn a lot from previous reconstruction efforts, from various reforms. I know it's a very long book, 450 pages. It's about, 15 chapters. If you read one chapter per evening, just before you go to bed, you should be done in about a few weeks. So I encourage you to get the PDF of this. You don't have to buy it. It's actually free. And read it. And, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, please contact me. I'm going to write a second volume, and I'm looking for authors. Thank you.
Great. So maybe if you want to take a seat, I guess that's what we're supposed to do. So Yuriy, maybe you could sort of outline some of the main ideas that are in the book that you think are important going forward, and then we'll sort of start the discussion, and then we'll involve the audience. Okay.
Thank you. I would like to start with kind of principles of what we want to do. What is the end game in the reconstruction? And one objective we have is to build a fully fledged democracy, a successful economy, right? So that's our objective. This means Ukraine has to be a part of the European Union. And, sometimes people take it for granted, but it's not a guarantee that these two tracks, reconstruction and EU integrations, have to be the same. So it's the first principle. The second principle is that rebuilding Ukraine is not about restoring Ukraine to the state it was just before the war started. So we don't have to kind of renovate Ukraine to the February 23rd, 2022. We have to use the strategic war to deeply modernize the country. It means not just hardware, it means institutions, it means the rule of law, it means corruption. We have to deal with all of these issues. It's very important. It is also clear that Ukraine is not going to have resources to rebuild itself. It's going to need a lot of help from the rest of the world. It's going to be very important. And in this dimension, it is critical that Ukraine receives a lot of aid in the form of grants, basically aid that Ukraine doesn't have to repay interest or principal. That is going to be very important. We also have to understand that the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be successful only if Ukraine owns this process, right? So you see various destroyed places, cities. If we want to build a bridge in Bucha or Mariupol, we have to build it there because the local community needs it. Because ultimately the aid is going to be withdrawn. These local communities are going to maintain it. They have to value what is done. And so it is important for Ukraine to have voice, to have skin in the game. That's going to be very critical. Now, I don't want to spend an hour lecturing you about the principles. We have a long list of what we need to do there. But, I want to give you a few main takeaways, what we get from this book. And the first takeaway is that, if we want to have successful reconstruction, we have to minimize damages now, right? It sounds obvious. Well, sure, of course, it's energy infrastructure, it's this and that. But it's much bigger than this. Think about schools, education. We have now a generation of kids that had 2 years of COVID, now 1 year of this war. So for 3 years didn't have proper schooling. We have to do something about this. Now this means concretely, for example, that you have to have bomb shelters in every school so that they can operate in person. Seems like an obvious thing, but it's not done. We advocate for this. We say resources have to be allocated to that. The second main lesson is that we see a lot of aid flow into Ukraine. Okay. But it is also clear that this aid is not enough. The institutions are not there to coordinate aid. The amounts are not sufficient to support the Ukrainian economy. And now imagine this is happening today when the war needs are extremely, very acute, right? So if you don't get money today, you may have no country tomorrow. Now when the war is over, it's very clear we're not going to have the same level of pressure. So we have to develop new institutions, new instruments to pay for this reconstruction. It's going to be very important. The other main takeaway is that no public money is going to be enough to rebuild Ukraine. The estimates vary, but it's anywhere between $400 billion and $1 trillion. It's a lot of money. No public institution is going to have resources for this. It's not going to be just the US government, the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF. None of these sources is going to have enough funding to pay for it. It has to be a collective effort, number one. And number two, really modernization is not about public money. It's about attracting foreign direct investment. This is the main source of growth. And so everything has to be centered on that. You have to use leverage of public money to attract more private money. And sometimes it means you have to make, subsidized interest rates. You have to offer military insurance that, if something happens in Ukraine, you can get paid off by, somebody if your factory is destroyed by another missile strike or anything like this. We have more main takeaways, but I want to make sure we have a conversation, so I'll stop here.
No, I think this sounds very reasonable. I come from the angle of the restructuring that took place in Central Eastern Europe 30 years ago as centrally planned system was being replaced by a market economy and the legal and institutional framework consistent with it. And I would sort of second what Yuriy was saying in terms of the institutional development, legal framework that will be very important for the state to function effectively. Infrastructure obviously will be very important. There are some lessons from that period and even from earlier, from the Marshall Plan. 30 years ago, I just by sheer coincidence talked to Professor Thomas Schelling from Harvard, who was very senior at the time, but he was one of the builders and creators of the Marshall Plan, the economic part of it. And he was pointing out, saying, you know, there was a lot of money involved, but what was even more important was that we prevailed on the Europeans at the time to start trading with each other. And it was the fact that they opened themselves up to trade that created the miracle, the economic miracle of the 1950s. So, you know, the obvious lesson is for the European Union, and of course the US and everybody else, to open themselves up to Ukraine as soon as possible to allow them preferential, hopefully free, totally free access to the market. So that's important. The other lessons that came after World War II, which I think are relevant here, is that the reconstruction of both cities and countries was much faster than was expected because of the presence of human capital, that there were people who were capable. So while physical infrastructure was destroyed, if one combined people who were experienced and educated together with an inflow of financial capital, the reconstruction of cities like Hamburg and Hiroshima, you name it, basically was much faster. And in fact, the Western Allies underestimated severely how quickly it was going to take the Soviet Union to reconstruct after World War II. The estimates were off. The reconstruction was much faster. So those are, you know, positive, optimistic, sort of promising aspects that if the policies and the resources are allocated appropriately, and if the state starts functioning, and I think the way Ukraine is proceeding now shows fully that it's not a failed state, that it really is determined to become a modern state, then I think that the results may come. It's going to be difficult, but they may come faster than maybe we expect. So all that has to come together. And the transitions in Central Eastern Europe indicate that some countries did much better than others, so there are obviously better and worse ways to go. But I think that here it's it's definitely a question of when the war will end. That's obviously very important, and what kind of reconstruction can be done already now. Speaking of the shelters in schools and hospitals and so on, and what can be done, right after. So maybe, Yuriy, if you have a few more takeaways, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
I will just want to reiterate that, you often hear the reconstruction of Ukraine is not going to work. We have the experience of Iraq, we have the experience of Afghanistan, lots and lots of money invested in these places, but, the end result was not very satisfactory. But, we should understand that, these countries are very different. In some ways, they're failed states. You had to start from scratch. Ukraine certainly is not a failed state. You have a functioning government. You have a functioning financial system. The trade continues. You have successful sectors in the economy. For example, IT is one of the biggest success stories in Ukraine. And it has a lot to offer to the European Union and, the global economy more generally. So this makes me optimistic. The human capital is there, the fundamentals are there. Ukraine is very, very close to the European Union. If you think, who is going to likely benefit from friendshoring or things like this, Ukraine is probably number one candidate because it's so close to European Union. It has highly educated human capital. So every reason to be successful. And as I said, it's not a failed state. You already have lots and lots of preconditions to be very successful in the reconstruction.
So I will maybe just add to it that what's important is that so far both Western Europe and the US have enthusiastically, both at the level of the people and at the level of providing assistance, military and otherwise, have been really gearing up and helping, and hopefully this will not ebb. Hopefully this will continue, and that's, I think, a prerequisite, both in terms of accepting refugees and integrating them and providing education for children of the refugees and so on. And here, what's interesting in terms of the geopolitical and economic aspect is that this situation is one where for the first time the countries of Central Eastern Europe are pushing the European Union to be active. In other words, it's not Western, the traditional Western part of Europe, it's actually the Central and Eastern part that is providing the impetus that we are observing everywhere. So I think that's important. Bruce, we'd like to bring you in. Why don't we give you the microphone a little bit?
I think first place, thank you so much for those opening comments. It is an interesting book. If you'd like to read about what can be done sector by sector in the Ukraine economy and foreign direct investment, these are important topics: health system, education. So these are the reports which are made. Except what's interesting about it is talking about a country which right now is in war, and looking forward, and we can see a vision of what can be possible for this country as it emerges from this conflict. We should hear from you. There's a lot of people here from this part of the world, or curious about it from what you read about. You can tell these are experts. They're nice experts, so they don't bite too much, that kind of stuff. So let me see some hands up, maybe of people who would like to ask a question, and I'll kind of maybe run down there, and I'll come back for you. It's okay. I'm gonna work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very interesting insights. I was wondering a bit about your first point regarding education and how to reduce the damages as they are happening. For instance, regarding schooling, could you maybe provide some more examples of what can be done now already to reduce the damage that is happening as the war goes on?
Matt, we got to get 2 microphones here. 2 or 3, right? But maybe take a second question too, right here. Okay.
Hi, I have twice worked in Ukraine on the legal side, once at the embassy and once as a special advisor to the prosecutor general. And what I found is that the entire legal system is an obstacle. I look forward to reading your book, and I don't know whether you address the problem of the entire legal system. But if not, then I would urge you, even though you're an economist and obviously the legal system is not your primary concern, to think about how Ukraine could be helped to change the entire legal system from law schools going all the way up.
Thank you. I'll start with the education thing. There are many things you can do. For example, I mentioned the bomb shelters. It's one example. Another example is that you have many faculty members, for example, if you think about higher education, who have very few resources to conduct their research. You don't have heating, you don't have electricity. And for example, one thing we do, I'm a member of a group called Economists for Ukraine. And Tanya Babina is also here, a member of the group. What we try to do is to raise money to give non-resident stipends to Ukrainian scholars who are in Ukraine so they can function. They have resources to pay their utility bills, they can go to their labs. It's one of those small things that can make a big difference because these people operating in very difficult conditions, almost desperate conditions. And, even small amounts of money can go a long way. So there are lots of examples like this. The legal system, I must say, this network is mostly economists. We don't have lawyers among us, which is obviously an important mission, and we would like to have more people from kind of legal department, if you will, to help us write laws and everything. But I agree with you, one of the key messages we have in the book is that we don't have to wait until the war is over. Start to reform the legal system as soon as possible. We have to have new courts, new judges, new training, new mentality. One specific thing, for example, you can do to accelerate this process is try to adapt the regulations of the European Union as quickly as possible. This is going to be good not only for kind of bringing Ukraine closer to the rule of law, but also to make sure Ukraine is aligned with the European Union and can become a member country, not just a candidate country.
Yeah, let me just add that a number of initiatives on the educational front are taking place. So schools in Central Eastern Europe, and I started or helped start an American-style graduate school in economics in Prague. That's for students from all over the former Soviet bloc. So we, for instance, have an agreement with the Kiev School of Economics that their faculty can come in, students, and so on, exchanges as needed. So that's taking place. I mentioned how the acceptance of refugees has been very positive in Europe, and very often classes in Ukrainian are set up so that the children can continue right away. So those things are very important. On the legal framework, I actually have an interesting story. Early in 1990, we were brainstorming about what to do. This was in Czechoslovakia, how to transform the country, including the legal system. And one thought that came up and was recommended was to bring in essentially legal experts from Western Europe, which was just switching from European Community to European Union, and created a mutually internally consistent framework, legal framework. And they said we could come actually and graft it onto your legal framework because you're going to be heading into the European Union anyway in a few years. And it's a framework which was tested and checked and so on and so forth. It just was not politically feasible. But it was an interesting idea that there were frameworks that could be taken and grafted onto the local framework and possibly avoid all the major problems. I would say one of the really major problems in all these transition economies was the functioning law, legal system, and enforcement. Yeah.
So a question back here. And state your name.
Sorry?
State your name.
Hello, thank you. My name is Olena. I'm just curious if your book addresses the issue of sustainability, especially in terms of European Green Deal and transition into a circular economy.
You guys make me work. Dean, I have to raise my pay for this, you know.
Hi. So I wanted to ask about the efficiency of the disbursement of foreign aid in Ukraine, and how do you envision the most efficient way to deploy the capital on ground where it's most needed?
I can't believe my friend Tano is quiet. I've never seen this before.
Hi, I wanted to follow up on what you said about the legal system. And you said that in Czechoslovakia, a reform that would have been feasible and useful was not politically feasible. I wonder whether that doesn't suggest that this reform in Ukraine should start immediately, when there is possibly the political pressure to make it happen.
Thank you. The Green Deal, it's, one of the, we have a chapter on energy, how energy sector in Ukraine should look like after the war. And green transition is one of the biggest things we emphasize in this chapter. To be clear, we all care about the climate change and the planet and everything. So this is going to be a very important element of this reconstruction effort. But it's not just economics. The economics is there. It's also national security. You don't want to depend on Russia in any shape and form in terms of energy imports or anything like this. You want to be as self-sustained as possible. And there are many, many examples how this can look like. For example, many people don't know, but roughly 7% of housing stock in Ukraine is destroyed. You can kind of restore the buildings the way they looked before the war, but this is not really a good strategy because these buildings are not energy efficient. They are not particularly livable and so on. What we need to do is to start from scratch, have new buildings, make sure they're energy efficient. If you have an older building, you have to renovate and make sure it's going to be energy efficient. In fact, this is going to be one of the biggest spending components of any reconstruction plan. We're talking about anywhere between $50 and $100 billion. The disbursement of aid, we have a chapter on corruption and what we should do about this to make sure that money is well spent. And obviously it's going to be critical because this is others people's money. Other taxpayers have every right to know how the money is spent and make sure that it's not stolen or anything like this. And here we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have lots and lots of good practices developed for other countries, for other times. We can borrow these practices. For example, how you set up an auction. Who is going to do procurement? Should this be like a template where you just fill in kind of the names of who is doing what and this is going to be enough? How do you resolve disputes? You can go through the legal system, it's one way, but it's very complicated in Ukraine. Maybe we should have an arbitrage system when somebody from outside is going to take a look at this and make a decision. Is this fair and not fair? Who is right, who is wrong? It is going to be very important. Also, as a part of this, Ukraine has skin in the game. You can think of ways how you can incentivize people to apply for viable projects. For example, during the Marshall Plan, there was a matching funds kind of formula. So, you have a project which is worth $100 million. Local community or Ukraine has to come up with $10 million of its own money. So that 90 is coming from outside, 10% is your own money. That's your skin in the game. This is to make sure that resources are going to be effectively allocated. And about reforms, yes, we have this window of opportunity in many ways. Everybody is concerned about oligarchs in Ukraine and their influence. But, this is a unique opportunity in the following sense. They lost a lot of assets in eastern Ukraine. They lost access to the media. They don't control the TV channels, radios, and so on. The Russian influence is also minimized. So in some ways, you have this window of opportunity when you don't have to fight very, very strong vested interests. This is maybe Jan will use his experience from the Czech, reconstruction transition, but, this is once in a lifetime opportunity here.
Yeah, let me start with what Alessandro actually said. There are major windows of opportunity during situations like these, but they do tend to close pretty fast unless they are exploited, useful right from the start. So I think it's certainly no reason to wait for creating a blueprint, figuring out what it is, having people go through it, verify it against other systems that work or don't work, because I think that starting early is really important, because later on it's much harder. Let me comment on what Yuriy also said, that it's important that the locals feel that they are involved, that they are part of it. But I think a judicious combination of locals and external people is very important, precisely for ensuring that things are done without corruption, that local sort of lobbying groups do not have excessive power in determining what's happening. So I think a mixture of internal and external is actually an ideal way. And there is a lot of experience from the neighboring countries, Poland being a very good example, for instance.
Here. Please say your name.
Hi, my name's David Russell. My question is about military alliances and infrastructure. So the Ukrainians have been afforded NATO kit. They've been afforded NATO training. Do you expect them to be incorporated into NATO? And if so, how do you see that going? Question 2. At what point, when their infrastructure is destroyed, is it worth widening their rail gauges, changing their power scheme so they can be incorporated into the rest of continental Europe?
And state your name.
Yes, Yuriy Amelchenko, a question about the educational system. We have spoken about the support that Columbia is given to universities in Ukraine right now. We also know that large world-class universities create a dynamic economy. And are you aware of any efforts right now to create such universities in Ukraine on a scale that's equal to an establishment of a new university, perhaps? The background is there are about 80,000 foreign students in Ukraine before the war, and that's already an existing market. It's been successful. And it seems to be a promising field. Thank you.
I think I don't know what it takes to become a NATO member, but one of the key assumptions we make in the book is that security concerns for Ukraine are resolved. So it has to be some type of credible guarantee that no future attacks on Ukraine can happen again. It may be Article 5 in NATO, it may be something else, but it has to be a credible guarantee that another invasion is unlikely to happen over the next 5, 10, 50 years. Because if there is an unresolved security concern, if, for example, Crimea continues to be a part of Russia, or Russia continues to occupy parts of the Donbass, this is not going to be a solution to anything. We know from the experience of other countries in this region, Transnistria, Georgia, that if you have a frozen conflict, it basically makes these countries uninvestable, and we want to avoid this kind of situations. Now, the tracks, the railroad tracks, it's a very important question. It's not obvious when you look at the railroad network why these tracks were laid in a particular way. But if you look at the bigger picture and you include Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine kind of as one big map, you will see that tracks are going north-south because the network is Moscow-centric. And it made sense, if Ukraine is a part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, everything is going towards the center. This is not relevant for Ukraine anymore, hopefully. We want to be different from Russia. We want to be a separate country. And for a separate country, what is going to be important is that you trade a lot with the European Union, which means tracks have to go east-west, not north-south. This is one of the biggest investment projects. It's probably going to cost somewhere between $50 and $150 billion. And as a part of this exercise, you have to start thinking about changing the gauge of the tracks. Because if you want to have smooth transition from Ukraine to Poland or Czechia or Slovakia, you have to make sure that the gauge is the same. It is going to be expensive. It's going to take maybe 10, 15 years, but it was done in other countries before, so it's certainly doable. And it's a very worthwhile investment, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of national security, because what we see, what Russia is doing today, they basically use the Ukrainian tracks to transport weapons and personnel in eastern Ukraine, in Crimea, and so on. We don't want this to happen again. What was the second?
No, I think that's good. Let me just amplify. That question is a very good one. Let's go back. In 1994, Russia, the United States, Britain signed the so-called Budapest Memorandum, which assured Ukraine that they wouldn't never threaten or violate its borders, right? So those assurances obviously have not been lived up to. So one will have to think what kind of guarantees, which is more than assurances, are needed. And NATO membership is one, but obviously it has all sorts of ramifications, as does entering the European Union and the political and economic benefits. So I think it's a very fundamental question as to how that should be done. And this is, again, something that can be worked on already now. One doesn't have to wait for the end of the war to start thinking about it.
And about universities?
Oh, universities. Yeah, I think the university question is a tough one. In fact, I would say where there has been failure in the transition economies of Central Eastern Europe was in their attempt or lack thereof to create first-rate research-type universities that we see in the West, in part because institutionally there was no restructuring. These universities are internally run under no pressure to really improve the quality. And so basically none of those universities are in the top 400 in international rankings. And this is now 30 years later, right? So it's not very, very encouraging unless one really restructures from the ground up and establishing, if you want, a US-type, highly managerially oriented but total freedom of thinking and research-type institutions.
So we're going to take a few questions, then we're going to wrap up, okay? So let me pass this all the way back to you, and then I'll come back for you. I won't forget you. Okay?
I was just wondering whether you could speculate a little bit about the future of sanctions, like what happens in Russia in the next year and a half, sort of as Europe becomes a little bit more energy independent, maybe as these sanctions are sort of slowly starting to kick up.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the whole budget, like the whole amount, is going to be roughly between 400 and 1 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. It's a pretty big range. Don't you have a probably more kind of precise evaluation of what it can be and detailed on like big buckets of split of this project, Marshall Plan? And second, like a quick follow-up. Basically, Russia has its money of around, I think, 300 billions frozen. Are you framing your new Marshall Plan as somewhat that's going to exploit this money, or any kind of reparations you're expecting from Russia to finance that? Thank you.
I'll start with sanctions. There are better experts in this room who can say more about this, but you know, sanctions basically have no limit to perfection, right? You can keep doing this over and over and over, and as you said, the European economy is less reliant on Russia, and for Russia it's going to be harder and harder to generate revenue in the global markets. Now, one story I like to tell how we should think about this is the experience of the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. In 1978-79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Then it was a series of sanctions imposed on the Soviet Union, and basically, technologically, it was very hard to import anything from the West. You had a few pockets what you can do, but generally, the modern technology was not available. And then in '86, there was a collapse of oil prices, and it became very clear that the Soviet model is not viable, right? You don't have revenue from oil, you don't have any technology. It was years and years of stagnation. And you know, Gorbachev started these reforms in the Soviet Union, not necessarily because he was the greatest Democrat. It was just very clear that this model is not functioning and they're literally running out of money. Now, the Soviet Union was a much bigger autarky than Russia, right? They basically didn't import car parts from Renault or BMW or anything like this. Russia is much more reliant on the West in terms of microchips, inputs, technologies, and so on. Almost every sector in Russia is very, very dependent. Think about car production. It's down by what, like 80%, 50%, it depends on the sector. Not because it just can't import parts. It's as basic as that. Now, I think Russia is going to take much less than the Soviet Union to collapse because they don't have resources. Sooner or later, they're going to run out of money. So it's just a question of time. There was a question about, you know, the range of estimates. You know, part of the challenge here is that Ukraine doesn't have access to many territories occupied by Russia now. For example, Mariupol, what is happening there? Nobody knows. You have, you know, various cities nearly destroyed, but again, you don't know what's there. So it is very hard to come up with an estimate. This is, you know, a rough range, and it depends on how you count losses, damages, and so on. So until the war is over, we will not know for sure the exact number. That's one challenge. About Russian money, I think, you know, from a kind of moral standpoint, if Russia attacks Ukraine, it should pay for damages. It kind of makes sense. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how difficult or hard it is to take this, you know, frozen assets and give them to Ukraine. But I would say that we had, you know, some precedents how this was done in the past. For example, during World War II, the U.S. government seized assets controlled by Nazi Germany and by Japan, and eventually these assets were sold, and proceeds were given to the victims of Germany and Japan. So this has been done. One more recent precedent of how this can be done is the actions of the U.S. government with respect to the assets of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. It was frozen and then basically redistributed to other purposes. Maybe it's going to take this model. I don't really know. But I think from a moral standpoint, it makes sense that the aggressor country has to pay for this in one way or another.
I fully agree. Let me just add that one consideration that may be important in how Russia can withstand or deal with the sanctions will be the position and actions by China, India, and countries like that. We see that a significant diversion of trade and financial flows goes in that direction. And so to the extent that there will be important economies that will trade with Russia and enable it to get the critical parts that it needs for production, that's obviously going to diminish the efficiency of and effectiveness of sanctions. Yeah.
Take one question left here, okay?
Thank you. My name is Roman. Thank you for coming here. I have a question on institutional reform. So in recent history, not many countries has implemented any kind of institutional reform successfully. So the question is, which challenges do you see are the most critical to implement it successfully in case of Ukraine, and what are the solutions to overcome them?
Maybe Jan will speak about the experience of transition economies and changing institutions. But I would say, there are many successful examples of how you can reform institutions. If we use the experience after World War II, we know Japan had to completely revamp its institutions. The same was with Italy and Japan. That was obviously kind of done under kind of external pressure. But this is just an example how you can turn, terrible institutional designs into something that became very successful.
Yeah, and I think that's where external players, be it the private sector or advisory activities by legal institutions, legal lawyers associations, American international legal associations, etc., can play a very important part. So the successful cases are the ones that, in some sense, looked at the best practices elsewhere and brought them in. I would say the less successful were the ones that tried just to change the local setup, and very often it was not very successful.
So I want to thank first Jan and Yuri for their comments. Yuri flew red-eye all the way from Berkeley, some corners known as Berserkly, probably still is. And Jan for coming in and talking about his deep background in this area. And then of course we have Zach in this wonderful, magnificent cafe, which is beautiful, and also serves delicious coffee and other kinds of things. And they have great music too. But I have a question I wanted to ask you. So you guys were great talking about these issues, and the questions were amazing to listen to, and there were important questions which were asked, and there were hard questions which were asked. About corruption, you had to answer questions on corruption. Everyone's wondering, why should the Ukraine today, when in 2014, be any less corrupt going forward? And you addressed that, but it's you talked about issues of the oligarchs. Are they suddenly going to go away? On this as an issue, and so there are, behind this discussion, there's always going to be issues of power. There's going to be issues of property rights, which was always a huge problem in these countries, and there's going to be issues of fairness, which is going to be faced as a result. I think what's interesting about this conversation is that images we see. We don't see the worst. I don't go on social media, so there's probably lots of things to see. But the things you see in public TVs or on the more sanitary sort of sites, you can watch it. Is really of destruction of the Ukraine, and you said that in the housing issues, and you talked briefly also about the number of immigrants, we'll call them, to the Western European countries primarily, but not only, they're also to South Asia, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. People actually have driven down to across these borders on the Russian side, but the Ukrainians also have made, trails through, I think, France and Spain and elsewhere, which you see. So there's hope here, and then there's also all which has to be done. So I wanted to ask you something, so to balance us a little bit on this. Let's just take the millions of people who right now are in Western Europe, and families broken up, and the men back in the Ukraine fighting the war, unable to leave if they should want to leave. So let's just take that as a huge issue of how are we going to reunite all these families, and will they come back, and will the human capital return to the Ukraine? And so, I'd like to hear something about this human side of the consideration, which is important. I could ask you a story about taxation, which it always comes down to, but we'll hold that for a discussion over dinner maybe. But tell me about this issue of families being reunited and what's going to be done for them.
Thank you. It's true. It's one of the biggest challenges, probably. You look at the images of destroyed cities and you wonder if life ever is going to return to these places. Who knows? We will see. But, frankly, we have seen these images before. You look at destroyed Hamburg or Dresden or Antwerp, and it was very, very bad, right? So you have the whole cities in ruins, and now these places are very successful. You look at Köln, it's a very dynamic city. It was totally destroyed. You look at Dresden again, it's a successful city, so this can be done. And so it's not really a question of, is this possible, not possible. We know for sure it's possible. The question is, what can we do to make sure people return to this? And I think the biggest challenge here is going to be if people have a place to return, right? So if they have a home, if they have an apartment, if they have a house, something that they can call home. And, one of the lessons I got from studying the reconstruction of Europe after World War II was that everybody focused on bridges and railroads, nobody focused on people, rebuilding homes. And it took a long, long time for Western Europe to catch up in this dimension, to build homes for people in Germany, in France, in Belgium. And this made, this transition very, very painful. So if I were a central planner, which I should not do, but if I were a central planner, I would devote significant resources to rebuilding the housing stock, to make sure people have a place to come back to.
Yeah, I agree. My reading of the situation, just seeing how the refugees are dealing with the situation, so I think many of them really are planning to go back, and this is good in Western Europe, where there are quite a few refugees compared to the United States, that schooling is available both in local language but also in Ukrainian to the extent possible. So it makes sense then for the children who can decide with their mothers to go back, because indeed it's mostly mothers with children that are, in the wave of refugees. The Ukrainian diaspora has been very, very important. I think that's not always stressed, that it's the Ukrainians already living in the European countries that have been very helpful. And I think there will be, rebirth, and some people will go back as soon as they can, and some may not go right away. But my experience is that sooner or later they'll be very helpful for Ukraine. So I think that it actually is an investment in human capital, which is both short-term and long-term in nature.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Thanks to Chris Moiser for all the work which he did, the unsung hero, Tanya Bamina, who had the contact with Yuriy and brought him here. To all of you who came to this great event, thank you. Thank you very much.